It's always nice when people exaggerate about you. It's a great pleasure to be here, and especially to see all of you this morning after all of the great Swiss hospitality and chances for socializing. What a great community we are, and I've seen Soihan's wonderful post this morning of the good time that we're having. So, and I hope that, both at the personal level, academic level, we continue to do that. Yeah, it's my great pleasure to be here and to thank Stefan. I'd say I'm relieved to be not planning a conference. That's a great joy, but to be here in this amazing location, the quaint city of Rapperswil, and this view, in Chinese we say, "You Shan You Shui," it's to be by the water, by the mountains, and to be with all of you. It's just the ideal time. I'd like to address my remarks this morning with this idea that I've been grappling with, that I think a lot of what happens with interculturality is that we have to have critical moments where something happens in our mind or our perception or our heart where we start to see things differently. So I've titled this Some Critical Junctures for Intercultural Research. And specifically, I want to address how can we better operationalize the different types of that we deal with in our field. And then, of course, COVID has had an impact. The war is having an impact. The new splitting of the world into quadrants is having an impact. So I want to make a few comments about that as well. So just as Ken inspired me to add a few slides, just so some of you know something about me. I've had my own long march. I'm a Kansas boy and a farm boy. I started in chemical engineering. We have a number of people who started when I found out Henry Triandis was an industrial engineer, I got excited. I thought, hey, there's a chance for me in culture research as well. But when I graduated from college, because I had all these Asian classmates who were so much smarter and better in the field than I was, I thought I better just be a teacher. And so I went to Taiwan and taught in Donghai University. And that led to a job working for a training company called Pan Communications in Singapore for 4 years, where I just had a lot of chances to travel throughout Asia. I tell my wife I traveled 31 countries looking for the right person before I met her, so that was wonderful. That was not in Asia, that was here in Germany. But and then I spent 4 years in Xiamen. She spent 2 there after we married. And then realizing I needed more academic grounding, I went back. So for those of you who aren't going straight through your career, but have worked for a few years, there is hope. I eventually got my doctorate at age 49 to 52. I did my PhD work in Berlin, which was a little late, but a lot of experience to write about then. So just that overview a bit. My background isn't this beautiful. I'm from the high, dry plains of Kansas. One town is Czech immigrants, the next town is German immigrants. Can you imagine they don't get along that well? Protestant, Catholic issues. And the next town is the Lucas Demons, so they're the non-religious ones. So, but from those rural roots, my grandmother instilled in me very early. Now, always remember that your grandmother's 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 brother was Abraham Lincoln. So we had the Lincoln legacy. Because, to be honest, the High Plains is not that racially in tune. My grandfather was very bigoted, a lot of jokes that were really not appropriate. And so I really grew up with this frustration of these narrow-minded situations and how could I interact with that? And when we did have a black family move to our town to help build the reservoir there, I got beaten up for being the one who was being a friend to the wrong kind of people. So, but the farm is part of my history. It's part of my past. This summer, I actually journeyed back, cleaned out all my things. We sold the farm, and so I'm now homeless in America if I go back. But I've also sold my guns, so don't worry about that. I'm no longer a gun-toting Republican. So, but Kansas is named Kansas because of the High Plains Indians. And so that was also part of in fact, Lawrence, Kansas has Haskell Community College, now Haskell University, which is a college for the tribes. So there's a very rich tradition. And so that was part of my background as well. But then I went from that rural environment. My hometown, when I was a child, had 350 people. Now I think it's probably 287, and depends on who died this week. We're decreasing. But then I moved to Shanghai, where 285 people live on one floor of a building. So I couldn't be in a more different environment. And this is a little bit of the street side Shanghai. We used to live on a street where my daughters knew all the vendors and would, they'd come home with goldfish and this treat or that treat. So, and then when I started my graduate program, it was just in one small little office with all the books we could muster. back in 2002. So that's the housing district that my wife and I moved into 20 years ago, and it's really become home. And to be honest, the Shanghai lockdown had a lot of challenging situations, but for communities like ours, we connected in an amazing way. I know more neighbors now than I've ever known because we had to buy food together, and so there were very positive aspects as well. But just a bit of seeing Shanghai, the old Bund, and then across the new Shanghai, about 5 years after we arrived, and then of course now the glowing, glittering, gleaming Shanghai of the future. So being in Shanghai, my whole job since 1993 was to develop intercultural training and a program of intercultural learning, and then a program of intercultural research. So I've been inspired by the greats of our field, most who have belonged to the academy, and that's been a great privilege. My initial guide for setting up my course was trying to figure out how could I adapt Robert Cole's survival kit for overseas living as to a guide for Chinese going overseas, and to understand our own culture and then other cultures. So the privilege of in the academy meeting Bob Coles for the first time in '98 when we had the Fullerton meeting, and then again we had a wonderful time when he was in Taiwan at the Taipei conference, and then in Kent State, and then shortly after that, well, he visited us in China and spent a week or two with us too. So, and Michael Bond, who hasn't been in the academy, but his influence on understanding Chinese culture, Chinese psychology, has also been one of my great mentors. So I'm just very, very thankful for that. The focus I'd like to deal with this morning are these points, reflecting briefly on the last couple of years of my presidency and the transition to Adam, but also how do we research interculturally? I think we research intercultural subjects, but our process also needs to be intercultural. So I have a few thoughts on that. And then, as many of you know, I've been dealing with history as one of the things I'm constantly working on, because I feel there's much about the past that we tend to overlook, and we think we have new things, but actually they've been mentioned before, but our citation process has only mentioned sites from about 2 or 3 years ago, and not the ancient works unless they were really, really influential. And evaluating a bit where we are at this state in the field, and then this idea of relocating culture in this process. So those are kind of the key things I'd like to cover. First, my great gratitude for this tribe, this great community. This has been our board the last couple of years, and the teamwork, the diversity, the perspectives that we bring, when we really have differences of opinion, how we've been able to, as interculturalists, discuss them is quite an exciting process, and I've grown so much as a person from that. So kudos to every face there, and if there's any that I missed in that Zoom picture, we've met mostly the last 2 years on Zoom, so what a treat to be here face to face. As Adam mentioned, it was our great privilege and burden to host the conference in Shanghai. And I think actually if we had just hosted IAIR, it would have been an easier venture, but we thought we would really try to integrate with our Chinese field. And so we had about 150 scholars from each present, which made it a very big conference. But it also meant we were dealing with 2 very different cultures of expectations. And so it was quite a challenge for our team. The webinar, of course, was easier, but to switch all that to an online format was also quite challenging. So thanks for all of you who contributed to either event, those of you who are with us in Shanghai, and the relationships of collaborative research that we've begun since then. I mentioned this idea of researching interculturally, and I'll address a few thoughts on that right now. First of all, I think we really do need to rethink and make sure we're not just doing comparative research, but that we're really trying to figure out, one, where are the interactions, but that we as scholars are not just following a statistical methods protocol or a qualitative methods protocol, but that we are interacting with the data in an intercultural way. Because we always have to see something from a second or third, or sometimes even another perspective. So this process of really trying to make sure that no paper that we publish is just a single method only, that there's always a reflective process built in. And certain journals may ask us to remove that, but I think we have to sometimes push back a bit and say, I really believe this interpretive piece or this angle is important to consider. So that's one thing I've really been grappling with, and especially the issue of meaning. Sometimes we use surveys from abroad, and we have not properly contexted them. And John Barry's wonderful article years back on the imposed etic is still something we have to constantly worry about, is that does this survey, does this frame that I'm using, does this theory even have relevance to my local culture context? And so that's something I would urge us to continue to think about. 2004 was a very significant year for me personally. I was asked in about 1999, 2000 to start teaching graduate students because people saw the program we had developing. And in 2002, my first group of MAs began with me. And in 2004, we managed to go both to IACCP in Xi'an and then to be at the conference that was delayed because of Feidian, the SARS, the first COVID pandemic, which thankfully wasn't as spreadable as this one, and we got under control quicker. But we missed a year of conference, and so we had that in Taipei at Taiwan Normal University. But this session especially, because I'm a values researcher and I'm constantly trying to grapple with the meanings, but this session was for me just brilliant because we had Michael Bond as the chair, the man who knows Chinese culture better than any other, so very much a contexted view of Hong Kong and Chinese expression of values in Hong Kong. And then we had Shalom Schwartz speaking from the universal perspective of how do we really see values, and his measurement of, at that time, his samples mostly had been teachers and pupils to try to really get a typical norm for values around the world. And then we had Yang Guoshu, very much looking at indigenous values in the Taiwan context and also doing some work in Hong Kong. So it was really helpful for me to realize, as a friend of mine says, every person's point of view is really a view from a point. If I stand here, I see the world one way. If I move over and take a different view, I've only got this bandwidth usually. I played basketball, so I actually got my peripheral vision stretched out quite a ways. But that's still not enough because there's always something behind me. There's another view that I don't see. So how do we get to that in intercultural research? What can we do to make sure that we're not just interpreting the data with biases that we already have? So this is something that I've been really grappling with. You may not have seen it, but in the Asian Journal of Social Psychology, Yanbing Zhang helped me and worked with our team. But Wang Liping, my colleague, and I began already when he was an undergraduate and then working in the international office to really try to figure out what are Chinese values expressed in Chinese sayings. And so my first paper that I presented at any conference in 1997 was a conference in Hong Kong Baptist University, and then Michael Bond and I talked about it, and Michael gave me a lot of suggestions on how to improve. So I went back, and then Wang Liping improved the methodology and published several more publications and how we would move it then from looking at Bond's Chinese value survey to Schwartz's more universal, and then kind of trying to develop an indigenous value survey. But this paper was really important to finally look at the data in a new way, collect the data in several different ways, and bring a 20-year process of looking at Chinese values to fruition. So, and thankfully the editors liked it, and it became the editor's choice paper. And they've got a very nice podcast on that about how they as editors liked what, and I think, again, thanks, Yanbing, for your work in helping us polish that paper and bring things we were grappling with a long time. But it took the third set of ideas. It took a scholar who had been doing very, very good work on intergroup communication to relook at our Chinese data and help us interpret it in new ways. So those kinds of collaborations and long-term processes, I urge you all, don't give up on papers that didn't make it into a mainstream journal, but you may be able to keep adding data and get to what you really will be able to say, this piece of work represents what I really had as a passion to bring out over a long period of time. I love this quote. I use it in a lot of my classes. I'm a big C.S. Lewis fan, and the Space Trilogy is, I think, a very brilliant. In fact, that Hideous Strength book probably describes some things we see going on in the world right now. But he has this, in the first book, where Ransom basically goes to Mars and is trying to figure out this new world. I love this. He gazed about him, and the very intensity of his desire to take in the new world at a glance defeated itself. He saw nothing but colors that refused to form themselves into things. Moreover, he knew nothing yet well enough to see it. And I love the last sentence. You cannot see things till you know roughly what they are. And so how do we develop our observation, listening, understanding skills? And the last sentence also implies we do try to frame everything we see in the frames that we already have. So it takes effort to view something in a new way. So to be intercultural in our research, by definition, it means we really do need to look at dynamic interactions. If you heard Seth's presentation yesterday, the journal really wants to be publishing not just one sample, insights into one culture, not just comparative research. There are plenty of other journals that do those kinds of things, but how do we deal with the interactions, the dynamic aspects of how people communicate, how people work out problems, how people mentally process difference, and find some new form of commonality. So between one, two, or more cultures, and that really try to dig beneath or beyond the structures of our disciplinary mindsets, our standard methodological procedures, or our hypothesized findings. Of course we need hypotheses, but hypotheses are often a jumping to a conclusion before the data, and we really need to make sure we don't just confirm hypotheses, but understand, is there something we may have missed? It's a meaning-making process. Our field has a wide variety. This was something from my dissertation of trying to look at the different streams, and I think in the Landis Bavuk volume, we probably drew out these streams of research better. As Seth mentioned, our journal is not focused on publishing textual studies. Again, there are plenty of other journals that do a good job with intercultural text, with translation, and that type of research. But we are focused on the descriptive and the interpretive paradigm, and then the whole aspect of looking at statistical and empirical processes or experiments, and of course now big data that can really help add a lot to a lot of our studies. And that's an extra third perspective that can really bring in. You do your study and then think, what could I look at for big data that might confirm? Is there some other tool out there where I could check my results with broader findings in the world or in my cultural context? So, the point of this diagram was to show that actually intercultural communication and intercultural relations as a field of study makes us go to that position of combining things, rethinking things, looking from a new angle. And when we do that, we actually have something to give back to the disciplines. Anthropology as a discipline, I believe, has developed because of some questions and issues raised. Communication studies has done the same. Psychology, because we are looking at cross and intercultural and maybe sometimes transcultural phenomena. So that's something to keep in mind. Many of us know the DIE illustration. As you can imagine, in cultures that don't like to talk about death, like China, that doesn't go over very well. So I've heard some use the DIVE, adding V for verify. We use C, dice. Some Chinese cultures really enjoy, the kind of the lucky gambling aspect. But besides describing and interpreting, this C of considering, checking, rechecking, asking local informants. And we can't spend enough time of circling around to try to find out, is there something I'm missing? Is there something that really only a local observer, only a bicultural person might help me realize, oh my goodness, we've overlooked something and we really need to go back and reanalyze the data. And then we evaluate, and I see this as a constant going cycle, just like you keep rolling the dice hoping to win. So we need to interact with our data. Is there something new and beyond? Are we demonstrating inter plus cultural vigor and looking for the meaning between things? The next part, some of you view me as a historian. I do like history, and I've tried to revive some things that I feel like were overlooked. I was very fortunate early on. Michael Prosser was one of the founders of the field in communication studies and rhetoric especially, and people like Fred Casimir and my tutor for my MA, Nobleza Asensio Lande, really exposed me to a lot of the early work. We read a lot of things that probably most of you don't read anymore, but they were really helpful for helping me frame my perspective on culture. And yes, some of them may have been just descriptive, but a lot of them raised very important questions. So these are some of the articles that we've kind of tried to help think about how can we revive the field in our own journal. And some of you know the chapter 3, and the new handbook in 2020. And it's a long one, partly because of the tables, but partly because we just have, history's complicated. And actually, the original draft was about 65 or 70 text pages, and I was asked to cut it down to 30, and then I managed to get 30 or 40 or 50 pages of tables in. But there's still a lot uncovered and unexplored, and so that's basically a roadmap for future research. The There's so many things we still want to do. I feel like understanding how intercultural has translated as a field to each cultural context is very important. I think we're still very too American and Euro-American focused in our research perspective. Understanding the key figures, organizations, locations, and what were the networks. When you read about Pittsburgh and what was going on in that dynamic of scholars from language, from education, doing intercultural training with NAFSA, it was an amazing network of people. And you look at the Minnesota group that had so much influence. It was also people in language, people in education, people in communication, and helping feed and foster ideas from different perspectives. So how can we keep looking at that? So we do welcome your contributions. If there's some aspect of a national history, of an intercultural organization, of an intercultural location that you are privy to, being able to have access to documents or know people, we would really value that. We have a journal coming out, or not a journal, actually a journal and a new volume on that. So, oops, going in the wrong direction. So looking at people in their complicated context. So Adam's given me 2 minutes. We started a few minutes late, right? I'll try. So one example is what we've uncovered about Rachel LeBoy. I won't go in that. We've talked about that before. There's some articles focusing on that. Let me get to the main point. Looking at ways to consider inter. Too often we see culture as kind of onion circles, but I think culture is actually much more contexted. When I think of my own background, who am I? As a kid, yeah, I'm a typical American, but I actually realized this little German town with Czech ancestors living between the two towns, and then on my grandmother's side, the Lincoln legacy, and then the experiences that I had. I actually have 3 or 4 source cultures in that context, not counting then the different kinds of cultural contact I had when I went and started studying engineering, when I went on my first trip overseas, and so on. So this process of understanding our cultures of origin, our cultures of socialization, our cultures of contact, and how do those frame us? So to get to that, we've drafted several articles in terms of developing, but I think John Baldwin has helped us realize that culture is really complicated. They have a long list of all the ways. Basically, they've updated the Kroeber and Kluckholm chapter on what is culture, and to realize that a lot of us do look at patterns. We can look at it with measurements. We can look at it from qualitative data. A lot of us are really trying to study the psychological dispositions behind culture, kind of the deep culture. And of course, there's always public culture. There's the power dimension. So how do we deal with, the critical, the interpretive, the empirical? And back to Seth's comment, probably the comparatist understandings aren't the best types of papers that we can be doing. So if that's the kind of work some of us have been focused on, how can we move to more of the process levels of going across what's happening between what's occurring within? And so we've tried to put forward a statement, and I would love any of you to interact with me, that, because my students are always, so what is an intercultural study? Because some, oh yeah, intercultural, I do that, and intercultural is about as, significant, the word love these days. It's so widespread. What's the meaning? But the working definition we have is that it's a study that adopts a comparative, contrastive, or transformative approach using, as Seth emphasized, some intercultural or culture-based theory from our field, from our legacy, to theoretically design, to highlight, analyze, or interact the processual aspects between at least one person, member, or representative of one identifiable cultural group, and whatever the trans or functional across processes are, there's some cultural boundary where interactions are happening. So this is one way of formulating. I think I'm going to ask Seth how he would revise it, and if any of you have ideas of how you would operationalize what is intercultural research, I would really value your input on that. I just mentioned, the comparative approaches we know, and that's not our focus, but how do we deal with culture is doing, encountering, interacting? This whole aspect. And so I ask my students, and you do the same, when you say this is an intercultural paper because, what's your definition? What's your operationalization? How are you going to put this idea, what research are you basing this on about someone who's going across a boundary, what's happening between, or what's occurring within as you interculturally change? So those are all in the Kulich English article. It's probably not real accessible, but we're going to try to reprint that in our Peter Lang series very soon. The other is culture as histories, culture as systems. And again, thanks to Tom Nakayama and Judith Martin for their excellent article in 1999 and their textbook, Intercultural Communication in Context. It helps us realize that we have to deal with inequalities. I didn't think of the inequalities in my hometown context, but they were there. And I was on the outside of a lot of things because I wasn't big enough to play football. I wasn't a stud farm boy. And so there were things I endured in that context because I didn't fit the mainstream. And then how do we help people in those inequalities to develop agency? We always have an applied aspect to our field. So how does our research inform advocacy or agency to help people develop? Culture as complex texts. Again, this won't fit our journal, but this is, part of the people in my university, and this is a big area in China of dealing with translation, interpretation. But we all have scripts. There are sometimes in our research very clear embedded scripts of how people think they should operate. And how are people embodying them? How do we see hybridity? Our identity studies, Colleen's new work on identity styles, I think brings this out as well. So there's a lot we can do with the transfer of cultural systems and how we detangle that. And then beyond that, how do we get to this both and perspective that I mentioned? We have a new journal, not in any way, it's not an SSCI, but we want to print more descriptive type works and biographies and things like that, where we're really dealing with dynamic interactions, our mixing, fusing, hybridizing world. The complexity of the world, just since things on the Eastern Front began to change a few months ago, really behoove us to be more careful of how we look at a lot of our theories of how is this going to change Europe? How is this going to change our interpretation of other parts? So for our journal, the both and perspective are some things we want to focus on, basically a dialogic approach and bringing in as many of the comparisons as we can. We also do this in our online course. If you've never seen it, there's been about 68,000. We've tried to embed this, and the course is outdated. We did it in 2015. We need to update it, but this is with the Future Learn platform. But we've thought about how to integrate that in blended designs, which worked out very well for the pandemic, for those who could be in class, to comprehend intercultural, to context identities, to compare communication styles, clarify values, and cultivate intercultural adaptation. But the bigger issue of the course is that we have all these thousands of students, each leaving 20, 30, 50 rich texts discussing their identities, their perspectives, and the research we can do on understanding the story behind the story and people's actual explanations of how they see something, why they react to something, and so on. So this is another kind of source of research. The state of our field, I think the journal is doing great. I think all of us are really advancing in our research. I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here because we are doing a lot of the things I'm advocating, but we do need to keep thinking about how does COVID change all this? The pandemic has made some major shifts. The war has made some major things we didn't think we would ever see again are now happening. So we need to examine COVID from all kinds of things. Collectivism does predict MAC use. There is anger about Chinese being stereotyped in the early stages of how do we deal with stress and anxiety, and how did the classic ideas of wisdom moderate. So these are some of the research we've done. But the statement that Rose made as the pandemic broke out, that we've reverted to a lot of things we thought we were past. There's been a shift back to more hyper-conservatism, and we need to think about all the classic areas of intercultural research and how will we reframe them moving forward. So that's a call to all of you. This is a key time for us to renegotiate a lot of the people's perception of post-colonial, our own cultural heritage, to overcome the post-globalization sentiments, the factionalization that we now have, clash of civilizations. Great power relations have now become very contentious, and post-pandemic reintegration and cross-border collaboration. So as I close, this was a statement we made in our solidarity statement. These are times when we need to step beyond our personal, group, or national interests and express empathy, solidarity, and attitudes, fostering mutual support and cooperation. So it's a key time, as Nietzsche put it, and this is where all of us contribute, so that one knows precisely the difference in perspectives, the effective interpretations in the service of knowledge. The more effects we allow to speak about the matter, the more eyes, different eyes, your eyes, that much more complete will be our concept of this thing, our objectivity. 1887. It's a little bit old, but I think you could cite it. So thank you very much, and I wish you all a good conference.